Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ben DuBose here. Welcome in to a mini-cast episode of The Lager Line, sponsored by Carbox Brewing. It's Monday, May 5th, and unfortunately, the Rockets' 2025 playoff run is now over. Rockets lost a home Game 7 to the Warriors on Sunday night, 103-89, and so Golden State ends up taking the series 4-3. The Warriors will move on to play the Minnesota Timberwolves in the second round, starting Tuesday night. So this is just going to be a quick hitting episode recapping what happened in Game 7 and really down the home stretch of that series in terms of bigger picture implications, what it means for the offseason, what should the Rockets do with some of their players that are at key inflection points, be it with their contracts or with their careers. We'll do a full episode later in the week with Paolo Alves, my usual co-host, diving into some of those storylines. Also on Tuesday at Toyota Center, Rockets general manager Rafael Stone and head coach Ime Udoka, they're going to meet with the media in their standard exit interviews, if you will, and address some of the key questions entering the offseason. And so after they speak, we'll have a bit more intel as far as what the Rockets are thinking, or at least what they want us to think they're thinking heading into the offseason. And thus we can analyze with a bit more depth, or at least more perspective from the decision makers inside the building. This is going to be immediate reactionary takes in the aftermath of a tough night at Toyota Center. I don't want to minimize it. Losing to Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Steve Kerr, and the Warriors for a fifth time in under 10 years, and a third time to have your season end in under 7 years with a home loss to the Warriors at Toyota Center. It's tough. And to see the optimism that was in the air throughout Sunday after rallying back from down 3-1 to tie the series at 3, that crowd to start the game was as loud as I've ever heard it at Toyota Center. To see the revival of Houston Rockets basketball, and then, as Ime said after the game, to lay an egg the way the Rockets did, to score just 74 points in the first almost 46 minutes of that game. Really, they had nothing until garbage time. To go from that high to that low, even if in the macro it's understandable, the Rockets are ahead of schedule, 52-30, number 2 seed in the West. Even if they lose in the first round, it was a hard-fought series. They went 7 games. They won a road elimination Game 6. There's lots of positives you can take away in the macro, and as we get more distance from the actual Game 7 loss, I think it'll be easier to look at the positives of this season and even this 7-game series over the past couple of weeks. But for right now, to lose to the hated Warriors again, it really stings, especially because I said on this pod last week, I didn't know if the Rockets would be able to get it to a Game 7 in Houston after they fell behind 3-1. But I said if the Rockets got it back, I thought they'd be able to finish the job. They did get it back, and then they couldn't finish the job. And honestly, they weren't even close. Really, ever since that Buddy Hield explosion early in the second quarter pushed it to double digits, Rockets did have one run in the third quarter where they got it to 3, but it felt like they had to empty the tank to get it there. And as soon as the Warriors pushed it back to double digits early in the fourth quarter, it never really felt like there was a point where the Rockets had a realistic chance down the stretch of that game. Bottom line, they just did not have enough offense, and that was the theme of the team for this season. They were a top 5 defense the entire year. Offensively, they were middle of the pack, and them being middle of the pack in offensive rating was largely because of their ability to crash the offensive glass. In terms of true half-court execution, what happened when they were trying to draw up a play to generate a good look? It was even worse than that. It was bottom 10 in the league. Their middle of the pack offensive rating was based on how good they were at crashing the glass and also getting out in transition and using their athletes like Amen Thompson, like Jalen Green, like Tari Eason to get them some easier buckets. When it is a half-court game, which tends to happen in the playoffs, it's a struggle for this team at times. Not all the time, But in a sport where you have to win 4 times out of 7, you're prone to one or two of these sinkers. And I suppose we should have seen it coming. Now, I think the Warriors caught a little bit of a break in that without Gary Payton II, who missed the game due to illness, it forced Steve Kerr to lean more into shooters like Buddy Hield. And so with Buddy coming out of the gates hot, the Warriors were able to play from in front. And with them having that advantage for nearly the entirety of Game 7, it allowed the Warriors to really squeeze the Rockets on the offensive end of the court, Houston's offensive end, that is, in that it felt similar to Game 1, which was also a slog at Toyota Center that the Rockets lost. But in that one, Alperen Sengun was at least making a majority of the one-on-one opportunities that he had against Draymond Green. I talked about, if you go back in our archives, the Warriors somewhat strategically leaving Sengun in single coverage, and the big night he had in Game 1 where I believe he had 26 points on 11 of 18 shooting. Kudos to Alp for making those shots, but strategically the Warriors were okay with playing with the trade-off of Houston getting 2s while Steph and Golden State's shooters got 3s. Well, in Game 7, it was pretty much the same formula, except Sengun didn't even make the 2s. He was 9 of 23, and a couple of those makes came in garbage time in the last 2 minutes when the game had already been decided. From Game 2 onward, Alperen Sengun's true shooting percentage was about 46.5. From Game 2 onward, the last 6 games of this series. That's even lower than the 48% that Jalen Green shot. Although, if you take away Game 2 for Jalen Green, that 38-point explosion, I think he'd be at 45 or 46% as well. So the bottom line is, with one exception for both players, your top 2 scorers for the season as a whole, Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun, were extremely inefficient in this series. And there were different reasons for both players. With Jalen, the Warriors really focused, and Draymond said this specifically after Game 7, they knew what the Rockets could be when Jalen was at its best. So they focused throughout the series on blitzing him and basically making it as difficult as possible for Jalen Green not to be able to beat them. That was the emphasis from Steve Kerr. And even when Fred VanVleet really got hot from Game 4 through Game 6, it didn't change that much. They committed a few more resources to Fred, but it was still a Jalen first defensive game plan. And so that's not to give Jalen a pass. Absolutely not. Because if it's as simple as, any defense can just blitz a top perimeter player and take them out of the game, well, then the Rockets wouldn't have to worry about Steph going off in this series. The Rockets had and have as many athletic wing defenders as any team in the league. It's not like they're super worried about guys like Moses Moody and Quentin Post and Gary Payton II, so you can shade help. And yet Steph is still, throughout this series, it wasn't peak Steph, but he was still pretty damn good. His true shooting percentage was above 63, by the way. If it was as easy to just take a top perimeter guy out of the game as just blitzing him, then that would happen all the time in the playoffs. It doesn't. So I mentioned the context of the Warriors committing those extra resources to Jalen to explain how it happened. That's not to say that it's okay. And, some of it's on Jalen. He simply needs to be better. He needs to develop some counters. I think specifically in Game 7, it was maddening seeing him take the James Harden 3s and layups approach, and I guess free throws as well, without being nearly as fluid or crafty as James Harden in any of those areas, and that he's not as good at drawing fouls. He's not as strong when it comes to finishing near the rim, doesn't have as much touch, and he's an okay shooter, but he's certainly not an elite one. So if the game starts off and he misses a couple of 3s, he's going to get a little bit tentative when it comes to those step backs. Not like his footwork is quite as polished as James's was either. Personally, what I would love to see Jalen work on this offseason is the mid-range game, because it felt like he was very predictable as the series progressed. He would take a couple of 3s earlier in games, and if it didn't work out, he was hell-bent on going to the rim. And so you would see Draymond Green and Kevon Looney just go vertical. Sure, they might foul him a little bit, but they know in the playoffs those are less likely to get called, and people look at Jalen. It's not entirely fair, but this is the reality, as being a little bit slender and likely to get bumped off his spots more easily than a standard shooting guard anyway on those drives. And one thing leads to another, and he's on the ground trying to get a call. It doesn't go his way, and then the other team has a 5-on-4 run out. And all of that's because there's just a one-track mind, it feels like, when Jalen passes up that three. If he doesn't take the three, he's going to go straight to the rim. And there's not a ton of craft. But I think more than that, he doesn't make defenders respect enough spaces on the court. They know that he's not going to pull from those in-between areas. And if he's playing alongside, which he usually is, at least two, if not three non-spacers, because the starting lineup has Alperen, Sengun, and Amen Thompson. Those are not shooters. And oftentimes you'd have Jalen playing with Amen and the double big lineup featuring Alperen, Sengun, and Steven Adams. Then if Jalen's not commanding space on his drives or making defenders potentially account for more space on the floor, and other guys are very limited in where they can shoot from, all of a sudden your offense can bog down because it is very, very predictable. And I think that's what happened with Jalen Green. And of course, the Warriors are willing and able to send a little bit of help off those other non-shooters, because especially if you're playing two or three of them at once, then there's just not enough space to pull them away from those help areas. And so, again, none of this is to say that it's an excuse for Jalen. He needs to develop counters. Or the Rockets, and I guess it can be both of these things, the Rockets can also strategically do some different things on their end in terms of how they structure their offense, when they get going, who they play Jalen with. There's lots of options here. I'm just presenting the context to explain what I think happened in a series where, let's be blunt, Jalen, for the year as a whole, was your leading scorer at 21 points per game on not great efficiency, but okay. This series, he scored below 15 per game. Even with a 38-point game two, he still was below 15 points per game for the series, and his true shooting percentage was 48, and that's factoring in the 38-point game two. Just unacceptably bad. And then with Alperen Sengun, look, I think the Warriors, it certainly helps that they have a generational defender in Draymond Green, who is just a perennial defensive player of the year candidate. And especially in Game 7, I think there was a little bit of a loose whistle, which tends to happen in these spots. And so with the twos versus threes conundrum, and I think especially with the Warriors getting off to that fast start in Game 7 with Buddy Hield leveling the Rockets with that early haymaker, I think that made the Warriors all the more comfortable to just leave Alperen Sengun, at least for a while, in single coverage. And if they're getting threes while Sengun makes a couple of contested twos, you live with it. And in this case, it was even worse than Game 1 in that the Warriors were getting some threes on their end, but Sengun wasn't even making the one-on-one opportunities against Draymond. And say what you will, maybe some of those were fouls, but it's Game 7. You got to anticipate that. And to Sengun's credit, he said after the season, or after the game, that this season was below his standard offensively. And it was. His shooting percentage tumbled from about 54% last year to 49.5% this year. His true shooting percentage was a little over 54, one of the lowest in the NBA for a high usage center. I'm not panicking because we've seen Sengun be better as recently as last year. So beyond the fact that both of these guys are still relatively young, 23 years old, the end of their fourth season, they're getting closer to their peak, but you're not at a point where either is close to the end of their development cycles. It's not time to panic. Yet, at the same time, when we see and we know that both of these guys are capable of better, we can call a spade and say they underachieved in this series. And yes, I know Sengun still led you in most of the counting stats for this series, like points, rebounds, assists, those types of things. And, relative to Jalen, he was the more valuable player in large part because he's got more tools. And credit to Sengun, he moved really well defensively in this series. The double big worked because Sengun was able to defend in space. So let's not act like it was all bad. There's a reason why you were in Game 7 in the first place. There's a reason why for the series, I think the teams ended up tied at 728 points apiece. This was extremely competitive. You don't do that if anybody is a complete zero. And with Sengun in particular, the counting stats reflect the fact that he was the guy amongst the starters who, well, has some advantages simply because of his size, but also played the most minutes because, in contrast to Jalen, Sengun with his size, his at least theoretical finishing ability, his rebounding, a little bit of playmaking depending on the game, there was always at least some value that you could extract from having him out there. And so because of that, he led you in most of the statistical categories. With that said, the efficiency can tell the story when it comes to production relative to, let's say, potential. And I think the best way to put it is that he underachieved, and so did Jalen. And Sengun was still, he was less of a problem than Jalen in the sense that Sengun was a more valuable player in this series, but that's because he's starting from a higher baseline. There's a reason why Alperen Sengun was an all-star and Jalen was not. In terms of the series overall, the Warriors, it's not so much that they thought Jalen was better than Sengun. They just looked at Jalen, and we've said this before on the pod, as the most important variable for this Rockets team. That if the Rockets couldn't get peak Jalen, they wouldn't have the ability offensively to win 4 games out of 7. And ultimately, they were right. It was the right bet, especially if they are generating quality threes on offense and Alperen Sengun is largely taking twos. That's a math bet that Steve Kerr was willing to make and turns out right to make. So you tip your hat. It sucks, but it was a good game plan and it worked. And so I guess for me, I come out of this while certainly annoyed to lose to the Warriors again and a little bit surprised, again, seeing how the Rockets dominated at home from about the midpoint of the third quarter of game 1 and then all of game 2 and game 5. I really thought if it got back to Houston that they'd be able to grind it out. But when you really think about it, this had plagued this team in high leverage spots all year, which is what game 7 is. Those games tend to be low scoring. Everybody's dialed in. There's lots of nerves. Officials let so much go. And when the games get in the mud, we saw it down the stretch of close games all year. We have talked about how much of a struggle it was, especially in the half court, late in close games. I think back to the NBA Cup run in December, which was a great learning experience for this team. But when the really impactful games came, the Rockets struggled to generate offense. If you recall, they won their group with that win at Minnesota. They had an 18-point lead, and the Timberwolves just blitzed them in the second half. Now, the Rockets ended up winning because the Timberwolves was one of those games, expended so much energy to come back from 18 down that they couldn't finish the job, and the Rockets won in overtime. They had a little bit more in the tank. But the Rockets could not generate offense when the Timberwolves were making their run. And then the 2 games in December, the quarterfinal game against the Warriors. Sure, it was great that the Rockets won. The final was 91-90, and you got a coin flip call to go your way with under 5 seconds left. You couldn't generate offense against this same Golden State defense. And then the loss to OKC in Las Vegas, it was just a rock fight. It was brutal to watch this offense, and the defense kept them in it, but eventually in the fourth quarter, Shea made a few shots, and the Thunder were able to get separation. And ultimately, the same dynamic played out in Game 7. And I guess one other thing I want to say relative to Game 1, it's fair to wonder, why were the Rockets close in Game 7, cut it to as little as 3 late in the third quarter, and never trailed by 20 until clearly everything was off the rails in the last 5-6 minutes of the fourth quarter, relative to Game 1, where they were down 23 points midway through the third quarter, and ultimately that proved too much to overcome. I think it's because in Game 7, the Rockets were so dialed in defensively. They did get better as the series progressed, and Fred VanVleet in particular got better. They were a much higher floor version than what we saw in Game 1. The Warriors at the end of the third quarter, when the Rockets cut it to 63-60 with I think 2 or 3 minutes left, they had just 63 points. The Rockets found some things in that series that worked defensively. And in the Game 7, you're going to be dialed in. Every possession matters, even relative to games early in a playoff series. And game one, there was a little bit of nerves, there was inexperience, there was rust, having not played a competitive game in 2 weeks. And so that's why in game one, even with Sengun making the shots he didn't make in game seven, the Rockets still fell behind 20 plus points, as opposed to game seven, where they were just close enough to stay at arm's length. But what ended up being the difference here, while the defense did enough in game seven to keep the Rockets theoretically in the game, the offense didn't even have the gear that it had in game one. And so even if game one was uglier from a score perspective in the first 2.5 quarters, I think game seven might have been a little bit uglier overall in that it just felt like there was zero formula for the Rockets to actually win that game in the fourth quarter. Because at least in game one, you could point to the success Sengun had in one-on-one situations against Draymond and say, hey, if they can get back into the game, make it close, here's something that you can do down the stretch of this game to land the plane. In game seven, there was nothing. And so even when the Rockets were loosely competitive, it was a struggle, at least for me, to come up with a roadmap that would have them winning that game. And so I bring up all of that context to say, I took a little bit of peace out of the way they lost game seven, and that for me, it was just a flashing red sign that said, you're not good enough. And if the Rockets, it's not impossible that with a little bit better luck, maybe Buddy Hield doesn't have that outlier shooting stretch in the first half. With a little bit better luck, maybe Sengun makes his bunnies. You could have grinded out game seven against a pretty flawed Warriors team. Like, they deserve to win, but let's be clear, a team playing Moses Moody, Gary Payton II, Quentin Post, extended minutes, I have a tough time seeing them do a lot of damage against the Minnesota Timberwolves or anybody else in the playoffs for that matter. This was a flawed team, and yet the Rockets just were not good enough and did not deserve to win. And in contrast to a lot of recent Rockets playoff flameouts, if you will, certainly the 2018 and 2019 series against the Warriors, and I know that's different because that's a veteran-led team near the end of their cycle. This is a young team on the upswing. But there was always that outlier, be it with the shooting, the 0 for 27 stretch, the officiating. There was always just a few things or a pivotal moment here or there that you could point to, and it made it difficult to swallow because you say, at least I do, man, if only that had gone different, the entire result could flip. This wasn't that. This was honestly what we saw throughout the season, which is that they are prone to clunkers. It might not happen every game, but it does catch up with them. And because of that, it's going to be really tough to beat a good playoff opponent 4 times out of 7, especially if the other team, and this would have been the case in the Minnesota matchup, has a rest advantage. So would I have loved to have seen the Rockets beat the Warriors? Of course, it would have been amazing. But I really don't think that this was otherwise a year that they were going to make serious noise. If you have these limitations offensively, if you are prone in a game where you are unloading the kitchen sink and you're at 74 points with 2 minutes and 15 seconds left, you're just not good enough, especially because we have seen this from time to time all season long. This is nothing new. It might not happen every game, but in a sport where you've got to win 4 times out of 7, it happened enough to where it's damning, especially because in contrast to the shooting outlier of 2018, this was the opposite. They were 3 of 14 on threes with barely over 2 minutes left in that game. For the game, the Warriors made 18 threes to 6 for the Rockets. But of the 6 for the Rockets, 3 came in garbage time. They were 3 of 14 with barely over 2 minutes left. That is ridiculous. And yet I can't tell you how they clearly could have gotten more without substantively changing the personnel. Yet to do that, you'd have to be turning away from the lineups that got you back in the series with Steven Adams and the double big and Amen Thompson, who was great in the second half of this series. I just don't know what the Rockets could have realistically done with the personnel that had gotten them to Game 7. I mean, they were playing 3 non-spacers in Sengun, Adams, and Amen Thompson together for extended stretches of that game. So I'm really not sure what they were supposed to do, especially if Sengun isn't making the 2, so the gravity isn't going to be there if not only do the Warriors have the math advantage, but Sengun isn't making the most of his one-on-one opportunities, and the Warriors are winning the game, so they're playing from in front. They just squeezed the life out of that offense, and I'm not really sure what the Rockets could have done differently. And I want to be clear when I say this. Steven Adams was incredible down the home stretch of this year, and I do hope they re-sign him. They'll have bird rights this offseason. But in a lot of ways, he was a Band-Aid for this team. They weren't planning on playing him as many minutes as they ultimately did. There's a reason why more than halfway into the year, they had not even tried the double big. This was no masterclass in coaching where Ime Udoka was just waiting until a few weeks before the playoffs to reveal this secret strategy that nobody in the league would be able to adapt to. No, it's more that, well, certainly there were a few injuries that contributed to it. It was a desperation strategy from a team that knew it wasn't good enough as is, so they leaned even more into rebounding, especially on the offensive side of the ball, to overcome their lack of creation, their lack of shooting, just their lack of scoring. Let's be blunt. If you can't make enough shots, get enough opportunities to where eventually you're bound to make a few or you get fouled. That's the strategy. But it's important to remember how the Rockets got into that strategy. And this is not a shot at Steven. He's still very important. Even if he's a traditional backup center, he's a really, really good one behind Alperen and Sengun. And it gives you the optionality to play in different ways. The screening, the rebounding, the passing. He's a very good player. And it would be a loss if the Rockets aren't able to retain him. More on that in our bigger picture pod later in the week. But in terms of Game 7 and the playoffs, this was not some masterclass in which the Rockets thought they had some sort of secret weapon and were just waiting for when to deploy it. No, they were desperate. That's what it came down to. They didn't think this was their best move. It's just everything else wasn't working. And to Steven Adams' credit, it did work pretty well for a while. But I just think, especially in the modern NBA, it's going to catch up with you if you are playing 3 non-spacers out of your 5 players. And with Amen being basically the focal point of this team. And by the way, Amen was spectacular in Game 7. If you want to talk positively, I think Amen doing what he did down the home stretch of this series from Game 4 through Game 7, about 20 points, 8 rebounds, 2.5 steals per game, fantastic defense, doing more on ball as the series progressed. It validates why the Rockets think he is their best player already and not far from being a legitimate star in the NBA, maybe even a superstar down the line. They are building around him, and they should. He is a special player. And really, I think people say that the start to the series was bad. It was, but you almost have to throw Game 2 out for men because remember how it went down. He had 6 quick points early in that game, and it was actually looking good for him. And then some really bizarre fouls took him out in the first half, including the third where Draymond and Steven Adams bumped him into or forced him to go to the ground. He undercut Jimmy Butler. That's what led to the pelvis contusion. And that was the third foul in the first quarter. It takes you out for, ended up being the half, I believe. And then by the time he came back, the Rockets are up by 15, 20 points. You're obviously not going to want to take the team out of the flow, go away from what's working. In that game, it was Jalen Green. And so people sort of had this narrative of Amen being bad through the first 3 games. Not exactly. He was bad in Game 1, certainly in Game 3, the first road game at San Francisco. There were a lot of guys in the Rockets who struggled in that environment. But Game 2 was an outlier. He, quite frankly, to me, by the eye test, looked like he was going to have a big night. And circumstances changed that. And then from Game 4 onward, he was very, very good. But one of the limitations, if that's your best player, and he's limited in where he can shoot from, and you also have 2 other guys who are very limited in their range, in Sengun and Adams, and Jalen Green gets very predictable in terms of how he attacks and the minutes that he's out there. Dylan Brooks, by the way, he had a big Game 5, but I thought he was disappointing in Game 7. He had some lapses defensively, off ball against Buddy Hield in the first half, and shooting wise, just 3 of 9, 0 of 3 from 3. A couple of those looks were pretty open. There just wasn't enough spacing to function. And with all the IQ in the world, and Steven Adams and Alperen Sengun are both very intelligent individuals, it's hard to overcome in a winner-take-all game where every possession means the world and everybody is dialed in. The fact that 3 of your 5 players just aren't respected beyond 8-10 feet. There's only so many things you can do. It's not a failure of coaching. It's not strategy. It's just the limitations. And that's why, in large part, the Rockets didn't want to run these lineups. That's why they didn't try to do it when the season started. That's why they weren't trying it in training camp. You'd implement that from the start if that's something you really believe in. No, it was sheer desperation. And to the credit of Steven Adams and the Rockets, they made it work, and they almost won a playoff series against a Golden State team with 3 future Hall of Famers and a great coach riding it. But I think what we saw in Game 7 is that there are limitations to that strategy, especially if your top scorers, in the case of the Rockets, Alperen, Sengun, and Jalen Green, aren't doing the heavy lifting. At some point, the math is going to kill you, and the math is not going to be your friend in the modern NBA if 3 of your 5 players are non-shooters. And again, I don't think that's a huge referendum on the future. I think they should and will want Steven Adams back. I don't think Golden State solved him. I think it's more a question of the double big, especially in a game where these other things are going wrong as well. Bottom line, Amen is a great building block, but with the shooting limitations, at least right now, it does box you in a little bit in terms of how you fill out that roster around him. Again, that's not a huge indictment of Amen. It's honestly not that different. Now, I'm not saying Amen is anywhere near Giannis, but there's a reason why the 5 in Milwaukee all these years has been Brook Lopez, who can space the floor out to 25 feet. That's how you unlock the best version of Giannis. And then they have brought in Bobby Portis off the bench. There's certain ways you have to play to bring out the best version of Amen, and I do think it's a fair question if, at least in a playoff environment, maybe in small doses here or there, but if you're having to lean into double big for 20 to 30 minutes per night, is that compatible with Amen Thompson? I don't know. And I really don't think it's a big deal because, again, I don't think this was the Rockets' plan in the grand scheme. It's just this was the best Band-Aid they had for this particular season. But what Game 7 reminded me of, at least, was that it was, in fact, a Band-Aid. There was a wound under there that ultimately was going to cause the death of this team. And we saw it in Game 7. And that doesn't mean that you need to panic. I'm open to bigger moves if it makes sense in the offseason. I'm also open to simply staying the course because a lot of these guys, led by Amen, should get better organically. You have a core 7. They're all 23 years old or younger. There's no reason to do anything rash. But at least for now, based on who they were in this season, and I think they all have great work ethics, they'll work hard in the offseason. But Game 7 was just a reminder that this team did not have enough. And we knew this all along. There were times if you squint hard enough, you try to convince yourself otherwise. But really, this team died the way we always expected them to die. It sucks, but this is something that if you understood the big picture, what the limitations of this team were going into the year, sometimes you, sometimes me, always us, it sounds great to say. But in reality, sometimes you need a guy to just go out and get you a tough bucket that you can trust. The Rockets didn't really have that guy. And that was the end of the season. A couple of other things. I've seen some questioning, could the Rockets have played more guys off the bench? Maybe, but, I've talked to a few people in the building. The sense was, and by the eye test, I think they're probably right on this, the Warriors were not a great matchup for Tari Eason specifically because of his propensity to gamble. And so if he's going to be out of position in a half-court game because he's trying to make the hero play, all of a sudden, especially when you're trailing, you're giving up that back-breaking 3 that can sink your chances. And so they're not going to bench him, but I don't think they had a lot of confidence in playing Tari 30, 35-plus minutes and it ending well against a team that's as savvy as the Steph Curry-led Warriors. And then Jabari, look, Jabari has a bright future, and I do think 12 minutes or whatever it was in Game 7 was a little low, but he shot just 1 of 5. Let's not act like he was going out there and, ripping the nets. It was a struggle. And I think game sevens are those scenarios where once you fall behind, you're going to run guys into the ground. The situation calls for it. You'd rather go out because your guys just, your mainstays, that is, can't get it done than you would turning to guys that are on the bench for a reason. And so you can point to, Amen had the calf cramps in the middle of the second half, probably because he was playing that damn hard in that third quarter comeback. Well, at least you had the comeback. Do we really think that if you had played, Jabari Smith or even Aaron Holiday in those minutes, that you would have been able to overcome a Warriors team winning by double digits in a game 7 and get back to at least briefly a one possession game? I doubt it. I mean, you should be open-minded. And if somebody has a hot night, you should be open to the Buddy Hield just outlier performance. But I think in the case of Jabari specifically, he just didn't have it going nearly to that extent in game 7. And we can quibble a little bit about the minutes being low, but I just think sometimes in a game 7 scenario, minutes are going to be artificially low or high, depending on whether someone is in the circle of trust, simply because even 1 minute out of a game for one of your mainstays, that can end up being the difference in whether your season extends or whether you go home. And I think Jabari just found himself on the outside looking in. It just wasn't his night. You can quibble over that. I don't think, he's 21. I don't think the Rockets are panicking over him. He's got a lot of room for further growth. I don't think it's an indictment of his future. Again, all of this is just based on who the Rockets are right now. And ultimately, the way they lost game 7. I've already gone on for 40 minutes, so I'll wrap this because it's a lot longer than I expected it to be. And I don't want to get into any of the bigger picture implication. We'll do that in a full episode later in the week after we hear from Rafael Stone, GM of the Rockets, and take a few days to decompress. This is my pod trying to make sense of what happened in game 7. I just think this team died from a lack of half-court offense. It was always there to some degree, not every game, but in a sport where you've got to win 4 times out of 7 to advance, you were going to have 1 or 2 of these clunkers. And, the source of optimism that I had when I was looking at how the Rockets could get back in this series is that, they played from in front most of those 2 games in San Francisco, game 3 and game 4 that they lost. Game 2 and game 5, they dominated. Game 6, they led most of the way. Well, at some point, this particular group, with where these players are at right now in their development cycles, they were going to be prone for another one of those clunkers. And it just so happened that game 7 was that clunker. And so it sucks, but in reality, this is sort of what we knew already. It is what it is. And now we move on to the offseason. And obviously the Rockets, they have a lot of assets. We'll see what happens in the draft lottery next Monday. Maybe they have even a better asset in this year's 2025 first-round pick from the Phoenix Suns. Keep your fingers crossed. Obviously, we'll cover that. No matter what happens with the 2025 Phoenix pick, they've already got plenty assets, young players to make a deal for a big name. It just depends on whether it's the right fit long-term. And the Rockets are going to be cautious because you don't have an unlimited ability to make these types of big trades. When you fire your bullet, you need to make sure it doesn't miss. The worst thing you can do is expend a lot of assets on a gamble, and then you end up with an older player, a more expensive player that takes up way more of your cap, and it doesn't even get you where you want to go anyway. At least now you're young and you have a lot of flexibility. You have the hope that some of these guys will get better organically. I do think they generally work hard, and so they should get better in the offseason on top of the usual development curve of NBA players. I think the mental makeup of this group is good. But in terms of where they are right now in May 2025, they just didn't have enough. And they were due for one of those games. It sucks that it came in game 7, but it is what it is. And now it's on to the offseason. And again, the more perspective, the more time we get away from this series, I think the easier it will be to think positively about what we learned this season. By the way, one positive note on the series before I close out the pod. I mentioned Amen Thompson being the guy from game 4 onward who clearly was the straw stirring the drink and the head of the snake, as Ime Udoka put it, and showing why the Rockets believe in him as a star-level player. Fred VanVleet, what he did down the home stretch of this series was remarkable. He carried them in game 6 on the road, which I think psychologically was big for this group to be able to win an elimination game on the road with that type of pressure. Even if they lost the series, there's a lot of positives you can take from seeing them not succumb to the deficit, to seeing the fight they had, which is something that Draymond and Steph talked about in their postgame comments glowingly about the Rockets, the toughness they played with. When your veteran floor general comes out and plays the way Fred did down the stretch of this series, basically 25 points per game on elite efficiency from game 4 onward, it sets a tone that younger players are going to follow. But more than that, I think it also reinforces that Fred still has that gear in him. And as I said a lot in recent weeks, I think his struggles, especially in the second half of this year, that was a bad ankle injury. I believe it was a grade 2. And then he re-aggravated it coming back in March. So he was nowhere near 100%. And it sucks because in January, when the Rockets had all those big wins, 2 against the Cavs, 2 against the Grizzlies, 1 against the Celtics, the best win of the year, Fred was shooting 39% from 3 in that month. He was figuring it out. And then February 1st, bad ankle injury, never the same. He was playing through it because obviously there's lots of intangibles, benefits that he brings to the floor. He helps your transition defense a ton. He still works the pick and roll with Sengun really well. It's not that he was a negative by any means, but he did not have the juice that he typically has. And when you're an undersized point guard to begin with, if you don't have your usual explosion, it doesn't take a lot for your efficiency metrics to really take a hit because you're not able to get those easy buckets the way most NBA players can. And so I acknowledge that, the true shooting for Fred went down from, I think, about 57% last year to like 51.5, 52 this year. It doesn't look good, but I think injuries were a big part of that story. Not going to say age is nothing. He's 31 now, and small guards, they don't always age well. I do think Fred's high IQ like Chris Paul, so there's hope that he'll age more gracefully than a lot of his counterparts. I'm not going to say you can't argue for age being a part of what happened, but I think it's more just a fluke injury that was more severe than the Rockets let on. That's nothing new with the Rockets. Lots of teams are cagey about injuries, but they managed him well down the home stretch of the year. And we saw throughout most of this playoff series, had a bad start, but honestly, he had good looks in game 1. They just didn't go in. The last 4 games, by and large, they went in. It kept the Rockets competitive. My God, Fred was playing so hard. He was picking up full court. He was diving on the floor in the backcourt. He was leaving it all on the floor. And the fact that he could do that, I think it should tell you that he's still, by and large, at least in my opinion, the guy he was a year ago. And is he a cornerstone player? No. But I do think it shows you why the Rockets intend on bringing him back, be it picking up the last year of his existing contract or, declining that and re-signing him at a lower, more team-friendly figure. Either way, I think from everything I've heard, he's likely to be back. And I think this series should show you that even if you were worried about Fred a few weeks ago, he's still the guy he was a year ago. That poise is still in there. And especially in the playoffs, there's value in being able to trust a guy to bring out the best version of himself when the games matter most. Fred VanVleet is one of those guys. So for a team that's not going to have cap space no matter what, based on the extensions the Rockets handed out to Sengun and Jalen before the season, they already made that choice. I think it's clear you should want Fred VanVleet back simply because it's not like you can really replace him no matter what you do. But this series, it taught me that, or it showed me that you should be pretty excited about it. It's not a move that you make just because, well, you can't replace him. No, he's still a really high impact player when he's right. And honestly, in this series, I'd say, you could argue for Amen or Fred as your MVP of the series. They were your most valuable players, and they were the reason you had a chance in Game 7. There just was not enough supporting help. Collectively, the offense just didn't have it. And because of that, your season is now over. Anyway, I'll wrap it for today. Boy, I thought this would be like 15, 20 minutes, end up being 45, but y'all know me. Anyway, this will do it for today. Unfortunately, playoff run is over, but lots to look forward to this offseason. Lots of options for the Rockets. They will have a lottery pick from the Phoenix Suns coming their way. How high will that be? We'll find out in a few days when the lottery is held next Monday. Also, the end of season press conference from Rafael Stone. That will be Tuesday. We'll hear from him on a number of these subjects as far as the offseason ahead, what the Rockets are thinking internally, what they're looking for potentially externally. We'll be able to react to what Rafael says and do a little bit more deeper dive on where the Rockets go from here. Today, just wanted to give a few, immediate reactionary thoughts on what went wrong in this series, what we learned, and then with Paolo and guests in future episodes, we'll talk a bit more big picture. Anyway, this is it for today. If you want more content before the next show, the best place to get that is on social media. You can follow me at Ben DuBose on Blue Sky. And then this show, The Logger Line, is on Twitter/X. And if you go to the link tree in the bio, you can find links to distribution partners like Apple, Google, and Spotify. Subscribe, leave a positive review if you've not already. But also links to our friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carbach Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Hit up those links and you can enjoy their content as well. All right, that'll do it for today. Unfortunately, Rocket season is over, but this podcast is not. Should be a very fun off season, and we'll have you covered right here at the Logger Line.